Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 28 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Dallas Stars, in which the Sharks have won 2-1. Sorry for the delay on this review. There were some issues last night just based on the weather where I am, and it was kind of unable to film at that point, but I did still manage to watch the game, and it was a pretty solid win for the San Jose Sharks. Pretty stereotypical win, I guess you could say, for this Sharks team this year. It checked really all of the boxes. The Sharks managed to score enough goals to get the victory, though not as much as the Sharks probably would have liked. Same goes with the amount of chances they got in this game. Only ended up with 2 on the board. They had a defensive effort where they gave up a decent amount of shots. They were outshot in this game, 35-25, but they didn't really give much great opportunities in the middle for the Dallas Stars to score. And, which at least is stereotypical for when Reimer is in nets for the Sharks, they got very solid goaltending. So in the end, I take a look at this game, and while it might not look particularly good if you try and look at the deeper advanced stats of possession and all that, the Sharks actually played rather well and put themselves in a pretty good position to take the 2 points, which they ended up doing. Now, this first period started off, it was a pretty odd first period because it would be the Sharks that would have the only goal of that opening 20 minutes. That would come from a Tomas Hertl deflected in goal. It goes off of his knee on a Timo Meier shot. But it was actually the Dallas Stars who had the majority of the possession in the first period and outshot the Sharks pretty significantly. And yet, even though you say that, while there was a couple of good chances for the Sharks on the few shots that they had, there were also only a couple of good chances for the Stars. Like I said just moments earlier, the Sharks did a very good job at keeping the Dallas Stars' chances to the outside. And so in the first period, I believe there was that Joe Pavelski attempt where he goes for that backhand and hits the post. But otherwise, besides that, I can't think of too many moments where the Stars had some really great efforts. Their only real chances besides that Pavelski shot came from a couple of misplays from James Reimer. Reimer, of course, returned from injury for this game after missing the past few, and Adin Hill was forced to start those games. Reimer looked a bit shaky to start this game off. He was giving up some pretty easy rebounds on some of the shots from the outside, which allowed for a few more opportunities than the Sharks would have liked, but Reimer definitely settled in as the game went on. So that first period, there were some brief moments, but as we moved on into the game, things got cleaned up rather well. In the second period, honestly, this was the Sharks' best period of the game by far. They were actually quite competitive with the Stars in terms of possession. They would once again score the only goal of that second period. That one would come from Erik Karlsson, who remains hot, gets his 8th goal of the season. Quite impressive for a defenseman, absolutely. This one was challenged by the Dallas Stars. At first, it looked close to being offside. I remember when I saw the Sharks actually enter the zone on this particular goal, I said, well, that was very, very close to offside. And so I thought they were challenging for that, but they seemed to actually be challenging for goaltender interference, where Tomas Hertl's stick does indeed make contact with the glove of Braden Holtby, but I believe the call ended up being that Esa Lindell, the defenseman behind Hertl, kind of pushes Hertl enough that it's not really Hertl's fault that he makes contact with Holtby. So in the end, the goal ended up standing. I definitely could have seen an argument for it to come back, but I'm certainly not going to complain that the Sharks' goal stood. They got a power play because of that. That power play was completely awful, but in the end, it didn't particularly matter because the Sharks did still score that goal, and they had the 2-0 lead at the end of the second period. Come third period, the Sharks fully committed to the turtling strategy. They decided to just continuously get pucks out. They were not really pushing much at all for any sort of offensive chances. They had like 1 or 2 maybe in that third period, but not much. And the Stars did come close to tying this game. They would cut the lead in half with a Michael Raffle tip goal. But besides that, the Sharks continued to still keep things to the perimeter. Even when the goaltender was pulled, there really weren't that many close calls in that third period. And the Sharks closed this one out rather well with the 2-1 victory. Moving on to the lineups, there were changes as to be expected after that game against the Minnesota Wild, but maybe not the exact lineup changes that I, at the very least, was expecting. Because at the end of that Minnesota Wild game in that third period, the Sharks had put together a line of Hertl, Meier, and Jonathan Dahlin. And that line was so superb in that third period. I don't know how anyone could watch those three players play together in that third period and then not keep them together come next game. But that's exactly what Bob Booner does. While he does have Hertl and Meier together for this particular game against the Stars, he actually has them with Barabanov and keeps the duo of Couture and Dahlin together and has them joined by Noah Gregor. Bob Booner said that he enjoys the chemistry of Couture and Dahlin, so he just decided to get a bit of a change-up moving Meier with Hertl. And now, I do like this Meier-Hertl duo, and they did show off a bit in this particular game. Meier with another couple of assists for himself as he continues to rack up the points, and then Hertl stays pretty hot by getting a goal for himself. It's just kind of strange to me because that Meier-Hertl-Dahlin line was so fantastic in the end of that previous game against the Wild that it just feels weird that they'd end up separating them once again to start this game. Another thing on top of that is at the end of that Wild game, we saw a line of Couture, Gregor, and Labanc, and Labanc had looked so good on that second line that I thought he'd actually managed to remain there, but it seemed as though Booner did not want to reward Labanc that much, and Labanc actually started this game as well on the fourth line. But moving into more specifically how these players looked, on the first line, if you could really call them that, I guess you could maybe interpret this as the second line now of Gregor, Couture, and Dahlin. I don't think this line was particularly impressive. Gregor seemed on a completely different page than Couture and Dahlin, right? It's all swell and nice to say that Couture and Dahlin have great chemistry, which they do, but when you're putting them with a player who they haven't played with literally all season, and Gregor is a completely new player on this line, they definitely seem to be on different pages, so not the best line for the San Jose Sharks definitely for this game. On the other hand, the second line, if you could call them that, of Hertl, Meier, and Barabanov definitely was the Sharks' best line. It wasn't far and away brilliant, but certainly still very, very solid. Meier, very good game, like I said, racked up those 2 assists. Hertl still looking pretty good. Barabanov looking at least better than he has in the past couple of games. As I said, it didn't blow me away with their performance here tonight, mostly because a lot of the time was spent in the Sharks zone defending, and defending well, mind you. But still, this was the line with the majority of the offensive chances for the Sharks, so still a nice thing to see. If I had to guess, just based on this victory, these lines will probably end up staying together, but I would still like to see Meier, Hertl, and Dahlin put together once more. Onto the third line, I continue to like the energy of this third line. Players like Cogliano continue to impress me, even though they're not really putting up points. I like the fact that he's just continuously showing off his speed, laying some decent hits, and just keeping it hard on the forecheck. Bonino still seems decently in sync with the rest of the line. Matt Nieto, definitely no stranger on this line either. This line is just one that has decent chemistry. They're a good checking line. They're not putting up the points, but I sound like a broken record at this point when I talk about this line every single game, and that they've just been rather solid for the Sharks. On the fourth line, it was Labanc with Weatherby and Gadjevich. An unfortunate situation for the Sharks. I believe on Labanc's first shift in this game, maybe it was his second shift, he ends up taking a big hit from Hakanpää. It didn't look huge, it didn't look massive of a hit, but Labanc, I guess, goes into the boards somewhat awkwardly, skates straight to the bench, heads to the dressing room, and then does not return for the game. It's possible that this is a serious injury. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, and I cannot even diagnose it just from looking at what exactly happened on the ice. It doesn't look serious, but maybe it is. Hopefully, Labanc does return. Like I said, he had a very good game. It was a nice little rebound game for him against the Minnesota Wild after he was healthy scratched in the one before that. And so it's unfortunate to see him then immediately get injured in the following game. When it comes to the other two players on this fourth line, obviously they ended up getting shifts with players like Couture and Meier, so that definitely inflated their value in this particular game. Gadjevich had a couple of chances. Weatherby honestly didn't really have a couple of chances, but in the end, fourth line still not necessarily doing much of anything. Onto the defensive side of things, like I said, it was a pretty generally solid defensive game. Yes, you can definitely look at this pairing of Burns and Ferraro and say, well, They were hemmed into their own zone pretty significantly. But like I said, they kept things to the outside. There weren't a ton of dangerous chances through the middle. They did a rather good job in their own end. And so, yeah, you could say, well, you would like to see them play in the offensive zone more. And that's absolutely the case, especially when you compare them to the Sharks' second defensive pairing. But I don't think this was necessarily a bad game for either of those two players. And like I mentioned, the second pairing, though, definitely did perform quite well. And that, of course, features Erik Karlsson, the Sharks' likely best defenseman here tonight, and potentially the Sharks' best defenseman on the entire season thus far. Erik Karlsson has just been, especially as of late, very, very good for the San Jose Sharks. I wouldn't go as far as Bob Booner did. I believe there was a quote from last night in which he said that Erik Karlsson, this is the best hit that he has looked with the Sharks. You can't necessarily trust that because we back at the 18-19 season, I still feel as though Erik Karlsson was just insane during that stretch of games from December to mid-January that year, and I don't think Erik Karlsson this year has yet to surpass that Erik Karlsson from a few years ago, but he's definitely beginning to come close. He's just looked absolutely fantastic over these past few games. Not only has he been contributing at a high level offensively, not just with these goals, but just with the chances he's generating, but he actually hasn't been making as many defensive errors in the defensive zone, right? The fact that the Sharks were able to play a full, solid defensive game here tonight, and Erik Karlsson had very, very few errors in this one. There was a brief lapse of coverage, I guess you could say, on this goal scored by Michael Raffl. Doesn't really tie up his stick, but still not necessarily his fault on that particular shift. And so just generally, Karlsson, no real defensive errors, high level of offensive play. That's exactly what you want to see from number 65. On to the final pairing. Surprisingly enough, Simek comes back into the lineup. I found this to be a bit odd because Miloš did not have a particularly strong game at the end in that game against the Calgary Flames, but since the Sharks won, Miloš stayed in the lineup for the game against the Minnesota Wild. Then Miloš significantly improved in his performance in my eyes, and I felt as though did enough to remain in the lineup, but I guess since the Sharks lost, they decided to go back to Radim Simek. Now, I can't really complain too much about that because Simek steps in and actually does rather well. Not only does he defend quite well in his own zone, like I said, for all of the Sharks defensemen, but he also laid the body. He was also quite physical, which was nice to see. The Sharks had the physical edge in this game over the Stars for the majority of the 60 minutes, which was decently nice to see. Yes, this is because the Stars were playing mostly with the puck, and so when you're the team without the puck, you're kind of having to hit to try and get it back, but still, I liked the performance of this bottom pairing for the Sharks. They looked good enough in this game. And then finally, to talk about the goaltender, like I said earlier on, James Reimer returns from his injury. It was kind of a under the weather situation. Reimer himself said he tweaked a lower body injury, if I'm not mistaken, but he ends up returning here tonight. And there was a bit of a struggle in that first period. There were a good 4, 5, 6 shots that came from the outside that were rather easy shots to just sort of hold the rebound on, but Reimer ended up kind of bouncing it around a bit, which led to a couple of decent in-close opportunities for the Dallas Stars. But once he got settled in after that first 20 minutes, Reimer improved significantly and ended up being a very important piece for the Sharks to close out this game. So, as decent as Adin Hill did look in those, I believe, 6 straight starts that he had. He had a couple of good ones against the Flames and against the Islanders. The fact is that Adin Hill was still continuously giving up very early goals throughout games. He was still having the occasional really bad game, like against the Columbus Blue Jackets. And so it is very nice to see James Reimer back in net and resume the fantastic play that he had before he did go down with that small injury. He only lets in the 1 goal on 35 shots here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will take on the Vancouver Canucks. The Sharks, if they had played the Vancouver Canucks a couple of weeks ago, I would say would have been a much easier game on their schedule. But now, with their new coach Bruce Boudreau at the helm, the Canucks have looked a lot better. They have yet to lose a game with Boudreau as their head coach. They're 3-0, if I'm not mistaken. And so the Sharks could potentially have their hands full with their first non-Calgary Flames divisional opponent of the season. Class dismissed.